Could you start by telling me your name, who you work for, and a little bit about your job?
My name is Andrew Reisman, and I am an associate professor here in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. I teach within the Applied Biology program, but maybe more importantly, I am the academic director for the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm.
How long have you been involved with the BC salmon industry?
Very short time, and I would have to qualify the word involved because I'm not really involved. I have an interest in fish production and aquaculture, so I have started to learn about how fish are being produced, thinking about ways to improve how fish are produced, and working with some local companies in trying to identify a way forward. So, a year.
Have you run into any policies and regulations that have most significantly impacted your work?
I think that nothing yet because we don't have an operational facility on site yet. But I think the two sets of regulations that will impact us are organic certification and food safety handling for both the fish and the plants that come out of the facility. So I'm planning an integrated aquaponics facility that will have finfish, plants, and then other organisms, maybe snails, crabs, shrimp, whatever, and insects. And so understanding the regulations about how to make the entire system food safe and certifiable, as well as understanding the organic regulations to allow all the produce to be certified organic.
How has your personal role evolved within the Vancouver food system?
It's evolved probably dramatically. Over the time I've been at UBC, which is about 14 years, I started out in the ornamental horticulture industry and supporting them, and then slowly shift into supporting the UBC Farm and its mandate. And through that activity, I've become more involved with the local food systems and urban agriculture and many of the sustainable producers in the area.
How did your interest in aquaponics come about?
It came about because I always want to help the farm, the UBC Farm. I always want to help growers and farmers make more money, and I want to produce healthy food. So when I looked at all those objectives, one of the goals of the farm is to increase animal production on site. An integrated animal and plant production system is more sustainable. But because we don't have barns, we don't have infrastructure to support cows, pigs, goats, sheep, fish seem like a natural alternative. Small footprint. We have a very strong research community here at UBC dealing with fisheries and fish production. I think I can do something that fulfills all of those interests.
What significant changes over the past 40 years have impacted you or the Center for Sustainability most significantly?
Over the 40 years?
Over the past 40 years.
What has affected the Center for Sustainability? You mean the farm?
Yeah, the UBC Farm or your work.
Well, 40 years is a really long time.
Yes.
And it's seen a lot of changes. So over that time, we've seen a fundamental paradigm shift in the way we think about science and knowledge. So the farm's beginning was a very traditional research station where different disciplines and departments did their own research without talking to one another, and pretty much isolated from the community or the actual practitioners or users of that information. Then the paradigm shifted to understanding more systems approaches and sustainability and how that should intersect with our food system. So instead of just researching, how much synthetic nitrogen to put on a corn crop to maximize its yields, we're now looking at over a 10-year period what crop rotations maximize yields but also encourage a healthy environment, safe food production. So science paradigm, big shift. The second thing I think is land tenure. and how we view land and whether it's plentiful or scarce. I think early on we had a plentiful mentality, and that allowed development and various programs to move forward without much concern about running out of land. I think we have now shifted that into a scarcity mentality where we don't have that much land and we need to preserve it and maximize its use and benefits for society.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to the sustainability of our current food system?
Food illiteracy. People don't know, they don't know about where their food comes from, they don't know about what they eat, and they don't care. And they're not taking the time to become literate in their food choices. How they spend their dollars impacts the food system that they engage in. And that is their one way to actually voice a vote on how food should be produced or what food should be, by spending a dollar. But that decision has to be an informed decision.
Tell me about your current work with the Aquaponics. Is there any aspect of your work that you feel touches on the issue of sustainability?
Everything about it. The motto is only fish food in, only people food out. Zero effluent, full waste reutilization, and energy efficiency.
How does the salmon industry affect food security and sustainability in BC?
I don't know. How's the salmon industry? Well, it obviously increases the availability of salmon for people to eat. Whether the ways those salmon are managed, whether they be the wild fisheries or open pen fisheries, I think are debatable issues. I think land-based systems have their own challenges, but that's the way forward. And I think the salmon industry is starting to see that with the new development of many land-based recirculating systems coming online.
What are the greatest factors or influences surrounding sustainability issues within the BC salmon industry?
I think the order of environmental, economic, and then social aspects would be in that order. They are mostly being held accountable for environmental issues, whether it be sea lice or escapees or transgenics or Atlantic salmon being raised in the Pacific. Economically, I think that the economic case for land-based systems is still pretty close. So not many people are making money with it yet. So that would be the second tier. And then social sustainability as far as training opportunities. Many of the First Nations are getting into aquaponics and aquaculture because of the training opportunities and the economic benefits to their bands.
Are there any misunderstandings about the BC salmon industry that members of the public may have that you would like to clarify?
Sure. Not all fish are the same. And it comes back to being a literate food consumer. When you buy farm-raised salmon, do you know really what farm means? Was that ocean-based? Was it land-based? Was it sustainable? Was it with good animal welfare? Is it antibiotic-free or organic? So I think that the salmon industry actually needs to do a better job of informing the public about what it's producing and differentiating them. Many of the people I speak to say that the land-based fish are fundamentally a different product than ocean-based fish for a whole range of reasons, but they will all come to the stores farm-raised. So there's education on both sides.
When you talk about issues of food literacy, do you see any solutions that people would want to take to get people actively involved in issues of food literacy?
You know, food is like the thing we do 3 times a day, every day. If people don't care about it now, it's the way they were raised. So I think early childhood programs, mother training programs would probably be the best way. And then we just wait for this generation to grow old and move on and let their kids make better decisions.
What do
Is
you
that
think?
too cynical?
What can you do? What do you think are the biggest milestones have been over the last 4 decades in the BC salmon industry?
not a fish historian. I would think probably some of the fishing rights, limited catches, the introduction of releases to maintain the stocks. I recently heard a woman speak of the First Nations traditional fishing methods, and those understandings of how fish can be sustainably harvested have been lost from our current practices. Fishing on the in tide, not the out tide, selecting for different size fish and letting others go. Simple things that could be done that I think have benefits that have just been lost. So I guess just who can fish, when, where, and how.
What have been the greatest achievements of the UBC farm in the last 4 decades, and why do you think they have or have not worked? Failures as well.
The greatest achievements. I would have to say the greatest achievement was to, this is in my personal opinion, to convince the Board of Governors that we were of value to the university and worth preserving. I think that was a really important milestone. It legitimized the activities, it preserved them into perpetuality, it secured the land base, it raised the profile as not only a place where young people dig in this soil, but also a community outreach hub and a research center. Some of the failures, if there would be any failures, I would think it would come around the issue of meeting expectations. We do a lot of great things. The farm is at full capacity and more people want to be engaged with what we do there. But we're at capacity, so we are unable to meet expectations sometimes that people have.
Does the UBC farm have any difficulties in marketing, advertising, or promoting themselves or the salmon industry to the public?
Well, the farm has nothing to do with the salmon industry right now.
Right.
And if we decide to grow salmon, there might be an opportunity, but I don't know what fish we're going to grow yet. We're targeting salmonids, but we don't know that for sure yet. So, what was the first part of the question?
If the UBC farm has any difficulties in marketing, advertising, or promotion?
No, the farm is fundamentally a grassroots organization. That's what started it, that's what saved it, and that's what's carrying it forward into the future. So with that grassroots support, brand recognition is very strong. People want our products. We sell out of whatever we produce. So no, brand recognition, brand loyalty, and value associated with the brand are all very strong.
Where do you see the UBC farm and the Aquaponics Center going in the future?
I see this as being a research platform and a model training facility for aquaponics and aquaculture enthusiasts and commercial operators.
All right. Do you ladies have any additional questions?
No, I'm okay.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No. How will this be used? Is it too late for that?
Okay. So could you start by telling me your name, who you work for, and a little bit about your job?
Sure. So my name is Teddy Geach, and I am the Sustainable Seafood Specialist for the Oceanwise program at the Vancouver Aquarium. And about my job, I work with the Oceanwise program what we do is we help businesses to identify sustainable seafood options and then connect the restaurants with the seafood suppliers so that they have access to those sustainable seafood options. So I do a lot of kind of the back-end research and figuring out which fisheries we should be recommending.
How long has Oceanwise been involved with the BC salmon industry?
So Oceanwise has actually only been around for about 9 years now. It started in 2005, and we don't work specifically with the BC salmon industry, but we worked with sustainable seafood in general, and BC salmon does play into that.
Could you tell me a little bit about the formation of Oceanwise?
Yeah, so Oceanwise started in 2005, and it started as a really local initiative here in Vancouver with about 16 restaurants to begin with. And really, the program came about through our relationship with the Monterey Bay Aquarium down in California. And what they had done was create this consumer wallet guide, which identifies your best choices, some good alternatives, and fish to avoid. So we found these wallet guides to be a really great engagement tool to get consumers a little bit more aware of the seafood that they were eating. So the Vancouver Aquarium decided to become the distribution point for the Canadian distribution point for these cards, and we started giving them out to all of our visitors that were coming through. And the great thing was that consumers were actually using them. They were taking their cards to the grocery stores or to the restaurants and asking their servers or fishmongers what fish they were serving. But the problem was that it was still a little bit too difficult for them to use based on the fact that for certain species, like tuna for example, it was in every single category depending on exactly what species it was, how it was caught, or where it was caught. So it left them with this dilemma of, okay, do we order that option or not? So we saw this as a good indication that consumers, they want to do the right thing, they want to be able to choose sustainable seafood options, but it needs to be sufficiently easy for them to do so. So that's really kind of how Oceanwise came about. We said, okay, well, we just need to make it dead easy for people to identify what those best choices are. So by highlighting good sustainable seafood options on the menu with the Oceanwise logo, it makes it easier for people to pick out those good choices.
Have you had any policies and regulations that have most significantly impacted your work within the fish industry?
Like in the past?
Yeah, just have you run into any issues with like governmental problems or that kind of thing getting in the way?
I mean, Oceanwise, we don't work directly with government. We work more on the consumer-facing side of things. So, I mean, policies and regulations definitely come into play when we're assessing fisheries, but it's not kind of a major focus of our work in terms of kind of lobbying government or getting policies or regulations changed.
How has your personal role evolved within the Vancouver food system?
So I guess with myself and with Oceanwise, at the beginning our main focus was working with the restaurants and the chefs and helping them to identify sustainable seafood options. But that's kind of evolved into working more closely with the seafood suppliers as well, because these chefs need to be able to source their seafood from somewhere, and if the suppliers aren't engaged, then there's nowhere for them to be able to get those sustainable options. So we've started working a lot more directly with the fishermen and the fish farmers right at that producer level, as well as with large-scale distributors such as Albion Fisheries or Cisco to help kind of facilitate that transaction through the supply chain of sustainable seafood options.
Can you speak on behalf of the last 40 years and if there's been any significant changes that have impacted Oceanwise and the salmon community and the fishing community?
I think one of the major things that happened that kind of resulted in awareness about the sustainability issues was the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery on the East Coast. In 1992, the Canadian government declared a moratorium on the Atlantic cod fishery because it was so overfished, and this fishery has been around for centuries, over 500 years, and was the main livelihood for many communities on the East Coast. And this collapse really kind of was the first large-scale industry closure in Canada's history, and it was a serious impact for a lot of people. And I think before then we had this or people had this misconception that our oceans were an endless bounty of seafood that could never be overfished. And as soon as this happened, we started to realize that this was not the case. I mean, we've become far too efficient at taking seafood out of our oceans, and our oceans just can't keep up with us. So it's really brought to light the fact that sustainability issues around seafood are a major concern, and we need to have proper management and regulations in place to ensure that we're not overfishing fisheries, and having programs like Oceanwise to educate consumers around these issues and ensure that they're making better choices are critically important.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to the sustainability of our current food system?
I think probably general consumer awareness and education on, especially for sustainable seafood. Sustainable seafood and fisheries are so complex and they're changing constantly that it's really difficult, even for experts in our field, to keep abreast of what's going on. That it's just going to be impossible for the everyday consumer to be able to spend the amount of time necessary to have a good understanding of it. So I think education is key in terms of providing consumers with the appropriate knowledge to make those better choices. And as I said, with Oceanwise, we're trying to make it a lot simpler for people to make those better choices. We're doing the research for them.
Could you tell me a little bit about Oceanwise and if there's any aspect of your work that you feel touches on the issue of sustainability? And tell us a little bit about these. Kind of clarify.
Yeah, so Oceanwise, I think we're working directly in the field of sustainability. So as I said, I can give you a bit of background on the program. Basically, as I said, what we do is we work with businesses, we work with restaurants, seafood suppliers, retailers, anyone who's really in the seafood supply line, to help them identify and choose those better seafood options. So we do a lot of the research in conjunction with the Monterey Bay Aquarium to figure out exactly which fisheries or which aquaculture operations are the best, and then help make those connections through the supply chain with the chefs and seafood suppliers.
How does the salmon industry affect food security and sustainability in British Columbia?
That's a good question. That was one of the ones that I was struggling to
Good evening,
find a good answer for.
This is a reminder.
Hold on. Okay. We'll start to go again.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure how to answer that question.
Okay. What are the greatest factors or influences surrounding sustainability issues within the BC salmon industry?
Sorry, repeat the greatest factors or issues facing BC
Surrounding, sustainability issues within the BC salmon industry.
I think one of the main issues or concerns with BC salmon or fisheries in general is climate change and the effect that's having on wild fish populations around the world. Especially with salmon, they're extremely sensitive to temperature fluctuations when they're returning to spawn. And in the past, 13 of the past 20 summers have been above the warmest on record. And we've seen water temperatures in the streams and rivers rising. And this makes the salmon a lot more vulnerable to predators, parasites, and disease. And we've seen kind of, once the temperatures reach above 22 degrees Celsius in the rivers, we see mass die-offs of fish, so that's a big concern.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to sustainability of our current food system?
Struggling to find an answer for. I guess access to sustainable foods and seafood in general. I mean, with Oceanwise, I see that we're increasing access and it's becoming a lot easier for consumers, but I know 10 years ago the access was not there, the awareness was not there. And we've seen that kind of shift across the country as well. the awareness in Vancouver is extremely high, whereas out east and I was working in Toronto for a couple of years with Oceanwise, and the awareness around sustainable seafood then really was not at the same level as it is here now today in Vancouver. But it's starting to grow, and I think it's just a matter of taking the time to educate consumers.
Are there any misunderstandings about the BC salmon industry that members of the public have that you might want to clarify?
Not sure if these really relate specifically to your question, but some major misconceptions that we see a lot with respect to salmon is that a lot of people don't realize when they see Atlantic salmon on restaurant menus or in grocery stores that Atlantic salmon is farmed. There is no wild commercial fishery for Atlantic salmon anymore, just because it's been extremely overfished. And so whenever you see Atlantic salmon on menus, that is farmed and typically open net pen farmed. There are very few land-based farm systems at the moment, but there are a couple cropping up, and those are definitely better options. Another kind of misconception people have, not just with salmon but with seafood in general, is that when it's frozen, they have this assumption that it's not fresh, it's not good quality, which is totally not the case, especially if the fish has been flash frozen at sea. It's often far fresher when it's frozen directly on the boat. They can flash freeze these fish to super low temperatures, and when you get it, it's as if it's just come right out of the water. Whereas fresh fish that's not been frozen will often be on the boats for several days before it actually gets to your plate. So I think a lot of chefs and people need to realize that frozen is not always the worst option.
What do you think have been the biggest milestones over the last 4 decades in the BC salmon industry?
Yeah, that one I don't think I can answer.
Okay. Can you speak on behalf of fish in general and the fish industry? If you can't, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the BC groundfish fishery is a really great example of a very well-managed fishery that's come about in the past few decades. And the great thing about the groundfish fishery, it's an integrated fishery in that they have to count all of the fish that they take out of the water against the quota for that particular species. So for example, if you're fishing for Pacific halibut and you catch a rockfish, that's bycatch, you have to retain that rockfish and count it against the rockfish quota. So there's really not as much bycatch associated with that fishery because it's all being retained and accounted for.
What have been the greatest achievements or failures in the past 4 decades, or as far as Oceanwise has been in existence, and why have they worked or not?
Achievements of our program specifically?
Yeah.
Or, I think just the fact that we've come this far already. We now have over 570 partner businesses across the country that are all dedicated to sourcing and serving sustainable seafood options. I mean, we started as just a local initiative here in Vancouver, and now we have businesses across the country all the way from Victoria, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland. So it's great to see that community grow and all of these businesses that are committed to sustainable seafood grow. And I think one of the major successes of the program is the fact that we're working with chefs. Chefs have kind of become the ambassadors for sustainable seafood these days. We see them on TV, we see them doing these competitions, and they've kind of become celebrities in their own right. So people are looking to them to lead them and to direct them as to what food they should or shouldn't be eating. I mean, we've already seen this with the local food movement, the organic food movement, and now we're seeing it with sustainable seafood as well, which is pretty cool. We have a partner chef, Chef Ned Bell. He's the head chef at the Four Seasons Hotel here in Vancouver, and this summer he actually biked all the way across the country to raise awareness for sustainable seafood. So he was hosting events across the country at different restaurant locations and in like the prairie provinces that are really not as connected to the oceans as we are here on the West Coast. So it was really great to see him use his voice as a chef to get that message out there.
Does Oceanwise have any difficulties in marketing, advertising, or promoting your industry to the public?
No, I think we have been extremely lucky in the fact that Oceanwise is such a good news story that media love it, especially here in Vancouver. Media are very supportive, and they're very willing to share our story about sustainable seafood and the story of Oceanwise. In other markets, it has been a little bit more difficult to spread the word about our program. We do a lot of work in terms of
Good evening,
promoting.
visitors. This is a reminder that in 5 minutes, the Vancouver Aquarium will be closing. Please make your way to the exit located at the gift shop. And for your convenience, the gift shop will remain open for another half hour. By visiting the Vancouver Aquarium today, you have contributed to our research, conservation, and education programs. Thank you for your support.
All right.
So did you want me to talk more about the promotion of Oceanwise or of seafood?
If you're able to speak on salmon specifically, that would be great, but otherwise we'd love to hear more about Oceanwise in general.
I mean, we don't market or promote salmon specifically.
Right.
I mean, it's one of many sustainable seafood options that we do recommend and promote. But there's been, I mean, all of our chefs love wild Pacific salmon, there's no doubt about that. We have found that on the East Coast and in Toronto specifically, I think people are just more accustomed to eating Atlantic salmon. They're more used to the fatty content of Atlantic salmon than they are to sockeye salmon, for example, which has less of a fat content. So you do see Atlantic salmon on the menu a lot more often on the East Coast than you do in Vancouver. And I think that's just personal preference and just because that's what they're accustomed to. Whereas people on the West Coast, they're more accustomed to the leaner sockeyes. So.
What does Oceanwise classify as a sustainable versus non-sustainable salmon? Like what do you look for?
Yeah. For seafood in general?
In salmon specifically.
Salmon specifically? Well, I mean, the 4 criteria that we use for all seafood is we look at the abundance and resilience of the species. So we want something that's relatively short-lived, reproduces frequently, and has a lot of offspring. We don't want a species like orange ruffy, for example, which can live up to 150 years old and doesn't mature until it's about 20 years old. Those fish are obviously going to be overfished a lot more quickly just because we're more efficient in taking them out of the oceans than they are at reproducing. The other thing we look at is the management of the fisheries. So we want to make sure that there's strong management in place in terms of quotas, total allowable catches, to ensure that we're never actually going to overfish that population. They'll have other regulations in terms of seasonal openings and closures for fisheries, so they'll only be open for certain months of the year, fish for a certain amount of time. Sorry. The third thing we look at is the amount of bycatch associated with the fisheries. So we want to make sure that we're not getting endangered or threatened species at the same time as the fish that we're targeting, as well as the amount of habitat damage associated with the fisheries. So, for example, if you're using big bottom trawl nets as opposed to a hook and line rod and reel fishery, it's going to have minimal impact.
Where do you see Oceanwise going in the future? Do you guys have any goals that you wish to accomplish?
Well, I mean, our ultimate goal for Oceanwise is that sustainable seafood be the only option for Canadians, as well as for the rest of the world, ultimately. We envision a future where where we have diverse fisheries and aquaculture operations that are able to provide a consistent supply of seafood and provide the vital benefits, environmental benefits that the oceans provide as well. We think that industry really plays a major role in affecting this change towards sustainability, and it's going to be essential that both industry and conservation organizations work together to move the needle forward and make sure that they're sourcing sustainable seafood options. So it's critically important that industry be involved and make sure that they're following good management and yeah.
Do you guys have any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you.
No problem.
So where should we be looking?
You can talk to me or Gregory, whatever really works for you.
All right, so
Yeah. I'll be asking questions.
okay, we're doing the question asking, no problem.
Could you start by telling me your name, who you work for, and a little bit about yourself?
I am Sean Strobel. I work for Skipper Otto's Community Supported Fishery. I also, I guess, part owner of it. It's a family business. Skipper Otto is named after my father, with whom I learned to fish. And what else did you want to know?
A little bit about your current job.
What I do is, it's interesting. My current job is sort of in flux because we're growing as an organization, and I'm getting to step away from like the running of all things along with my wife and getting back to sort of being the on the water guy. I'm sort of the 1 foot on land, 1 foot in the ocean. I'm the liaison to the fishing community. I do our sort of purchasing, offloading of fish, and then I also work as a fisherman. And business that we've built helps sustain my fishing problem.
So how long has Skipper Otto been involved with the BC salmon industry?
Well, Skipper Otto, the CSF, has been involved, starting very small as sort of a side project in 2009. We've been really trying to make a real go of it since 2010, 2011 as a sustainable business. Skipper Otto being the person, my father has been fishing, and my family, fishing for salmon without missing a season since 1969.
Can you tell me a little bit about how Skipper Otto came to be?
Well, sure. Well, we started, obviously the fishing family. My father was fishing. I grew up fishing with him, gave it a shot in, my early adulthood, and then moved on to other things. But we stayed in it as a family, and it was getting to be really less and less lucrative to just be a fisherman. And we sort of, my wife and I were involved with, she was getting vegetables from a CSA and aware of what was going on in the food movement, and people pushing towards sustainable local food systems, and just sort of thought, well, could we do something like a CSA or farm share with fishing, and would this make what we do, what my father was doing, more financially viable, more sustainable, that way, year in, year out. And would people care enough to keep independence and small scale, sustainable fishing going? And so we started off small, started a little website and met some people through Farm Folk, City Folk, who helped us out with email lists of people that already bought food in that way. So they were already, so it was sort of, we were handed, like, here's a list of 700 people who already get their food directly from a producer. They might be interested, like, thank you, away we go, right? And so we sent this out, 40 some people the first year sort of trusted us enough to send us money if we promised to go fishing. And I didn't fish that year, I just passed it off, my wife and I did the pickups and passed off the fish got the fish from him and got them processed, and sort of tried it out. And the next year we grew up to like 200 members and started allowing, more members wanted to join then that we could take care of with one boat, and more fishermen knew what Dad was doing and we were doing, and said like, hey, do you need any extra fish? And well, we got the logistics already, we're doing these pickups, we might as well try to make a difference. And then sort of thought it through, and where could it go, and what kind of impact could we have on the industry and food systems. So, well, yeah, let's run with it and see how it goes. So that's sort of how we got going, and we've been trying to figure it out ever since. It turns out we didn't actually invent community-supported fishing. We thought we did, and there was no web presence for them, other CSFs at all, when we started looking into this in 2008. But there was a CSF under that name that had launched in 2007, 2008 in Port Clyde, Maine. But when we really got going, in 2008, 2009, we were basically tied for second with, there's one started in North Carolina called Walking Fish, and I think the Eastmans got going up in New England, a few others, but there were like 4 in the world when we got started. And now there's, well, according to the North Atlantic Marine Alliance, who sort of keeps track of these things, 35 to 40 decent-sized CSFs registered that they know of, and then there's smaller ones running in different communities. So it's a thing.
Yeah, that's cool.
And we didn't even know it was a thing when we started, but it's a thing now.
What policies and regulations have most significantly impacted your work within the BC salmon industry?
Well, okay, this of course goes, this sort of ties in with another question. I mean, what policies, of course we're a heavily regulated industry, as you would have to. We're doing resource extraction, really. The answer to that is it's pending. There's a lot coming down the pipe as far as like the trawlers. It's primarily salmon gill netting. Although we now have expanded to other fisheries as well, but we're, my dad and I are salmon gill netters, and we're still on a derby fishing system. So they open it for fishing and we catch until the Department of Fisheries says closed based on how many fish are escaping. The trawlers and the seiners, who also fish for salmon, are on a quota system already. So things could be changing quite quickly, and we'll see how that plays out. One of the things that has really affected us, in the late 90s, the Mifflin Plan came out, named after a former fisheries minister, died last month, I think. But that split the areas of the coast. We used to have a license, for example, like an A license to fish salmon. You fish the entire coast. You could only be in one place at a time, but we had the option to move. And that plan said pick your 1/3 of the coast. And that's it. So if you wanted to continue to fish all your former areas, you have to buy more licenses. So it would cost you, somewhere between $120,000 and $200,000 for the privilege to do what you could do the year before without paying for it. So it restricted the travel on the coast a lot. People fish more areas. I mean, in less areas. In some ways, it's can be nice. You don't have to guess where you're going all the time. You can save fuel, stick it out in an area. But there's less running around up and down the coast, although more people have just ended up buying a second license now. But very few people that I know of have 3 licenses. Nobody has the whole coast anymore. So you sort of pick and choose.
Is it feasible to like say you could afford the 3rd license, would it even be feasible to
Sometimes. Well, this year, I'll give you an example. I would have fished the Fraser a little bit if I had the 3rd license. I don't have, my family does not have an Area E license, which is Gulf of Georgia, Southern, Juanifica Strait, and the Fraser River. So Dad's got a D and a C on his boat, which is the North Coast all the way up to Alaska, down to Cape Caution, and then West Coast of the island and Johnson Straits. So he actually fished starting in June in the Nass, which is right at 5440 latitude, right at southeast Alaska, and then moved down to the Skeena, and then moved down to the Johnson Straits, and I joined him fishing there. So that in August we fished in what would have been another area if he didn't buy the 2nd license. We would have been, everybody was shut down, but we could keep going. But we didn't have the river license, which obviously you can't be everywhere at once, so you pick and choose.
How has your personal role evolved in the Vancouver food system? You said that Skipper Otto is a family business. Did you always want to be in the salmon industry, or was it kind of something that was...
No, I mean, I always did. I mean, I grew up in it and always sort of kept a hand in it, and we always knew the way to do a little better is to do more direct marketing, direct sales, not just hand it off to a big multinational company or, and so initially we jokingly sold, some of my dad's fish through what my wife and I called the Burnaby Housewives Network. My mother-in-law would call up friends, and all these people would come over like, oh, the fish is here, and we pass it on. We've actually moved a fair bit, and like, oh, well, that's, shot in the arm, did a little more money, selling off the docks and things, and trying to, play along, and then getting involved in the farmers markets a bit. But we've certainly become a much bigger factor in local, in the food system, trying to be a distributor of local fish, sustainably caught fish to local people, more visibly on a larger scale, our fish, others, other people's fish, and just sort of really get involved more with the community of food providers here, on a larger scale, because I think it's important.
What significant changes over the past 40 years have greatly impacted Skipper Otto most significantly?
Wow. Well, if you go back 40 years, I mean, there's a lot. I would say the biggest thing is the industrialization. I mean, it always was an industry, but the industrialization of the industry, the mechanizing, the capitalization of the fishing industry. I mentioned the Mifflin plan in the 90s. The real big first switch was something called the Davis plan in the 70s, where before you could buy a fish boat and get a license and go fishing. And once the Davis plan came in, that was it. It was capped. Since then, there had been no new salmon boat licenses since the 70s. If you wanted a new boat, you bought an old one. Or you bought the license off the boat that was being retired. What that was supposed to, and people that had been fishing for a long time had licenses grandfathered in, but anybody new had to buy in. Previous to that, there had been a number of, there were always the same fleet, there was always a troll fleet, and there were always gill nets. But the gill nets boats there were thousands of them. They were the smallest boats. The companies had rental boats. A lot of people independently fished, but would sell off to the big companies for, well, there wasn't as much of a fresh market, but there were a lot more small boats, independent family fishing. What happened with that plan is they said you cannot have any new licenses, but they allowed you to roll licenses together. So BC Packers no longer exists. It's merged with and then bought by Pattison Corp. And a lot of the companies took their fleet of small boats and bought up small boats and rolled the licenses together. And instead of having 3 30-foot gill netters that could catch, pack maybe 3,000 pounds, 4,000 pounds at a time, they built one 90-foot seine boat that could pack 85, 100,000 pounds. And the fleet, it actually, instead of reducing the capacity of the fleet, which was the stated plan, the Davis plan, it actually increased it by, multiples. You had less small boats that couldn't catch a lot, and fewer big ones that were run by a hired crew as opposed to family fishermen, and it made the small fleet in many ways kind of irrelevant. The big companies, they don't need us anymore to do all the canning, to do all the for what they need. They still want the fish when it's valuable, but they get it through their seine boats. They get it through the big the quota that they own. So for us, we were sort of marginalized. Then there was the huge monopolization of the industry. It was always monopolized, but since over the past 40 years, you've watched big companies merge. I mean, now you went from like BC Packers, the biggest, who bought J.H. Todd, who bought Nelson Brothers, along with Canadian Fish, to merging with Canadian Fish, to buying up Bellacoola Fish, to buying up Ocean Fish. Like even Ocean Fish now no longer exists. That's also a Pattison Corp company. It's just a label now. It's all done by a Canadian Fishing company. So the competition just disappeared. And then with fish farming coming in, a large scale aquaculture, well, it took away a lot of the market for sort of the utility grade fish. Your chain restaurants and things, they want the same thing on the menu all year long, right? It erased seasonality. So that took away a lot of the market for some of our fish. So it sort of pushed people to small boats, went from thousands to maybe 500 left. It's really, shrunk the fleet a lot, but the rise of sort of the local food system awareness, the ideas like CSFs, that was started by the CSAs, by people, the local food movement coming around, that's also, we were shunned to the side, but it made us free to pursue new opportunities, those of us that are still in. Now people want to come to the docks and get their fish direct because people are aware of how monopolized, not just fishing, but agribusiness and all types of things. So lots of changes.
Yeah. What do you see as the biggest challenge to the sustainability of our current food system?
Our current food system, well, I'll just speak again with an eye on the ocean, is the amount of corporate domination, the amount of large scale, like for instance, we sell tuna. Our tuna is hook and line caught by boats off the BC coast. It's all albacore. It's all considered as sustainable fishery. And yeah, there's a lot of them. And if you look at this boat and you see how we unload it, looks like it's caught a lot of fish. But then for the hook and line boats to overfish an area would take years before they would fish it down, and you could see it happening. The danger to me is like the largest tuna company in the world owns 7 ships. They don't have any hook and line boats. They seine for skipjack tuna with, while I was looking at the pictures of them, it's about a 1.5 kilometer long net that they circle seine and wrap it up in any fish that's in there. Of course you get the dolphins as well, which should be released, but 7 ships the size of ferries are catching all the tuna for the biggest company in the world, but those are big enough to do a lot of damage to stocks and sustainability before anybody even really notices. And it's offshore fishing. It's really not even regulated much. I mean, nobody really has authority. And these boats and ships also will go and fish on the coasts of any country that don't have a navy to be able to protect them, right? Like you've got Spanish and Portuguese fleets fishing heavily on the coast of every African country that doesn't have a navy. Right in. We used to have fleets fishing right here on the BC coast until 1977, when the 200-mile international controlled area started to be enforced, and all of a sudden we had more cash buyers coming to buy fish because they couldn't send their buyers. So countries like Canada, the United States are controlling that to some extent, but not everywhere can. And you look at these companies that are, shareholder-driven, profit-oriented. There isn't the same built-in sort of desire to see the next generation to be able to continue. When you're trying to maximize shareholder profit in your tuna company, you're going to maximize. They can't back off and say, well, maybe we should go a little easier. If you're allowed to fish, you have to fish. So it just sets up a dangerous potential over extraction.
Right. Tell me about. Okay, so could you tell me about some of the issues that Skipper Otto touches regarding sustainability?
Well, absolutely. We, if you're talking sustainability of the industry, of course, we try to make it viable for the independents and small-scale fishermen to be around by just getting a better price for independent fishermen and keeping up interest in what they're doing and public knowledge, increasing it by connecting the consuming public with the fishermen, and sort of keeping more eyes on the water. However, to talk about sustainability of, ecological sustainability, well, that's in that way we of course only fish using methods that are considered low impact. Mid-water drift gill nets, long line for our halibut. We don't use any draggers or dragged fish. We promote trapped prawns as opposed to dragged shrimp, and try to have an educational, one, fish sustainably, and 2, promote sustainable eating. A lot of people aren't aware that shrimp you might eat has a much higher ecological cost than the prawn you might choose. And so we'll try to use whatever platform we have to communicate that, and it's getting to the point that people are coming to us for sort of, hey, could you tell me about this? Tell me about that. So the education component, 1, the financial component of keeping the right people out doing this job, and then just walking the walk and fishing sustainably, and not taking shortcuts.
Was that always your goal with Skipper Otto, is to be sustainable, or how have your initiatives changed since the beginning?
Our initiatives may have gotten a little bit more, as we see some success, we think, hey, what, maybe increase our grasp a little bit, but it always was the idea that we're going to do this aiming for the triple bottom line. That had to be what it was about, and I think that that's also the reason for the amount of success that we've had, to whatever extent that is. That people don't just buy in because our fish is great. I like to think our fish is great, but it's the story behind it. It's what we're doing, that we're doing it right. That it's that in the face of this epidemic of mislabeled seafood out there, which you can read about in countless newspapers every year and online, that our stuff is shockingly transparent.
How does the salmon industry affect food security and sustainability in British Columbia?
Oh, well, hugely. it's, I mean, if you're going to eat locally in this part of the world, where we have one of the biggest salmon producing rivers running right to the south of our city in the world, you know, if you want to eat, you know, low carbon here, you should, you know, you involve some fish. They swim right to us. It, you know, just absolutely makes sense that it should be part of the diet for anyone that's consuming animal protein. It's also, I mean, keeping the, I guess, yeah, you're asking about the industry itself. As long as we protect this resource, it's you know, it should be food in perpetuity and huge amounts. I mean, we're not even in maximizing harvesting. There's certain areas where hardly anybody's even fishing, really, because it's not the most high value stock. But I mean, the fish is there in lots of places, and I mean, it's ecologically so valuable for more than just our own industry. The spin-offs of it. Salmon are, I mean, amazing fish. They're the only thing that actually takes nutrients upriver. You know, the response. I mean, everything else comes down with the silt, and the, you know, the wonderful farmland comes because of silt. You know, in delta silt coming down the river. Salmon take it right back up. They take those nutrients and they feed the bears and the eagles and everything else. They're supposed to go up there and spawn and rot, and you know, it's I mean, it's helps everything along the way, including, you know, agriculture.
What are the greatest factors and influences surrounding sustainability issues within BC salmon industry?
Well, sustainability of the industry itself would just be monopolization. I mean, it's difficult to be a new buyer, and you cannot go into, well, here's an example. I'm not saying anything controversial, it's a known fact. You can't go and get a buyer's license and go out with a cash buyer and go out and buy fish in an area without getting a phone call real fast from the big company saying, hey, I heard you're paying 25 cents a pound more than us, like, get in line. Like, the price fixing is open and acknowledged and technically legal because they're the buyers, not the producers. And you're allowed to price fix on the buying side. So it's a monopoly that's allowed because they're consumers. So that's a problem there. As far as sustainability of the stocks, which of course determine everything else, no fish, no fishing industry. Of course, we worry about things like the placement of things that can, factors that can destroy the stocks, right? Poorly managed fish farming, perhaps, which is a big concern to a lot of wild fishermen. How's it being done? You know, the last Royal Commission that came out looking to where the fish were recommended that, you know, there be a moratorium on extra fish farming, and particularly no more in the Broughton Archipelago. Well, this year they just ignored the rulings, and there's more fish farms going in the Broughton Archipelago. Okay, well, this is your own report. It said don't do this. You're doing it. It's the conflict of interest within the Department of Fisheries is one where the Department of Fisheries is supposed to manage the stocks, but it also promotes the fish farming industry. And like, you know, and that only happened a few years ago when the Supreme Court handed management of ultimate authority over fish farming from BC Agriculture to federal fisheries, and all of a sudden they were put in a basically conflict of interest. I see. They would probably have a different opinion. The other factors would be land-based, land use around salmon areas. Like, I know that one of the professors emeritus now out at UBC in the Fisheries Center said famously years ago that overfishing was causing dwindling of fish stocks over here. He's subsequently taken that back and said it was wrong. It wasn't at all. It was never an over-harvesting. The big reduction in licenses and boats and stuff was actually misguided, that it was upriver stuff. That you can wipe out, we can do careful management of a salmon area for years and not over-harvest, and one bad logging decision that wipes out, that doesn't leave enough riparian zone, and you have a landslide that wipes out a spawning bed and it's gone. The Fraser was almost knocked out completely in 1913 at the biggest run in recorded history because the Canadian National Railroad blasted a tunnel through and it caused a landslide and blocked the river entirely. Well, that was saved with the Hell's Gate tunnels, but that's the kind of susceptibility, the upriver stuff. So I worry about that, where it can go, especially with potential climate change. And here's an example, not from British Columbia, but in another famous salmon-bearing river is the Sacramento River. And the Sacramento River, I worry about what's happening there now with the droughts, because the Sacramento River went from millions of spawning salmon to only a few thousand, because they were draining off all the water for agriculture. In fact, they were down to like about 40,000 spawners, about 20 years ago. And they were just pumping the water out. And another Supreme Court case that was fought there said, in the United States, said, no, you have to leave enough water. The fish have the right to this as well. And they basically, shut the waters down to some of the farms. The spawning beds filled up again, and it took about 8 years, like 2 cycles, for there to go from 40,000 to 1.5 million fish. They came right back. And the problem was, there was no overfishing. The problem was there wasn't enough water for these fish to just get up there and spawn. And water is going to be a bigger and bigger issue. It rains more, it rains less. So these are sort of unknowns that make me think what can happen in the future is. No, I'm just pondering more and more.
I know you touched on this a little bit, but is there anything else that you see as some of the big challenges to sustainability in our current food system?
In the food system in general, I'm sure you'll hear the same thing from the farmers. It's just monopolies. Fewer stakeholders, fewer and larger stakeholders. And I think whether it's a big agribusiness owning a massive amount of the farmland, or one company owning a huge stake in 80% of the halibut quota and all the salmon boats and everything else, that it becomes too many decisions can be made in one boardroom, and then they have too much lobbying power over policy as well. Whereas you see areas like I look at Alaska, for instance, where you cannot be a quota owner if you're not actually a fisherman. You can't. So the same companies that are here are up there, but buying fish, not owning, to the same extent. And there seems to be a lot more responsive management. Also, local state control of the industry as opposed to federal. So I see, more distant oversight, less local control, local knowledge, less, and just less stakeholders involved. Worries me.
Are there any misunderstandings about the BC salmon industry that members of the public may have that you would like to clarify?
Well, one of the big ones is that there was an over-harvesting problem. And really now, even the Fishery Centre will tell you that really wasn't the case. There have been, now that's not to say there's never been an overfishery in certain areas, and it's certainly happened with small creeks and certain rivers, and one has to be careful. It's not, I'm not going to be the fisherman who stands up and say, put us in charge of our own monitoring. But the fact that salmon are an incredibly resilient species. If you leave them alone and we don't mess them up, they come back pretty fast. And that it is, that one can get worried about, rightly, the state of the ocean, due to hearing about things like the East Coast cod disappearing, the other stocks being endangered, and absolutely one has to work to watch them. But with salmon, the fact that it's a terminal fishery changes everything. The halibut with a cod, you catch them mid-life cycle, they could live for years more, they reproduce slowly, you don't really know they're gone until you're gone, so you gotta be careful. And with salmon, being that every single fish we catch was going to spawn and die within a couple of weeks. If the spawning beds were already full, then we should harvest. And that if you look at the numbers of fish that the First Nations were taking out of the water here long before there was any large-scale commercial industry here, and trading as far as the Rockies, there's been a long history, and that human involvement in taking these fish is part of the ecosystem. And has been for thousands of years, and it's very sustainable if we watch what we're doing and don't let other factors, mining, in sensitive areas, quick dollars from forest revenues, as opposed to looking at this as a food source that can go on for years and a long scale value to the whole province.
What have been your greatest achievements and failures from Skipper Otto in the last 4 decades or since you've been?
Oh, well, well, if you go 4 decades, then it's, 18-year-old getting an engine fire in the boat and not being able to do the carpentry to fix it properly, and there's been all kinds of things, but the fact that we fished safely for 40 years as a family or more, and and we've managed to hang around that long through a lot of ups and downs is something we're quite proud of. And as Skipper Otto, it's just being able to bring on more fishermen, to have other guys. Like I had an old friend of my father's who fished together since 1974, and this year when the price dropped for salmon in Barkley Sound, that he was like, oh, if it gets any lower, I'm going to pack all these down to Victoria and sell off the fish wharf, and I'll just skip next week's fishing because I won't give these away. And I said, well, we can offer you this much money and take it to our members. He'd like, oh, well, that makes me feel better, he said. I'm like, and that really, it feels good that we can make this, for somebody that's been in for that long, for the right reasons, coming in and say, like, yeah, that makes me feel better. And just seeing all the people that said, like, well, I'd given up on fish because eating fish because I didn't know what we were getting, whether it was harvested properly, and seeing them come down to the docks and get really excited about it, bring their kids down, learn how to fillet a fish, and become more knowledgeable. So I mean, in what's going on our coast, and it feels good to be involved in it, just seeing it grow.
Does Skipper Otto have any difficulties in marketing, advertising, or promoting the salmon industry to the public? Really, not so much. It started off seemingly kind of slow, but it just spreads. It spreads word of mouth because the public, or at least a section of it, is really interested. People come to us, they ask us questions, they tell their friends, they share it. Food is a big thing now. I mean, we always knew it was really important, but now it's so many people are proud to be involved in. There's not the get off the farm, sort of ideas anymore. People watch TV shows of other people fishing, and Google, I wonder if there's anybody here, and come up, I get phone calls from, people like, I was just thinking somebody should bring fish to Calgary, and we could get it from a fisherman, and there you are, so, okay. So no, it's actually, getting the word out has been surprisingly easy. Also with, of course, things like social media, and, us having smart people around, it's easier to get social ideas and social ventures to get the word out now and spread it. Where do you see your company going in the future?
Well, we want to be able to control our quality and take hold even a little bit more. So we're really looking at the viability of creating our own small processing plant. We've always had our stuff as much as possible processed locally, hand cut by, grown-ups paid real wages, as opposed to a factory that's being shipped to. I mean, the processing end is something we want to keep local as well, and being able to take more of it in-house. And for us, I mean, a processing plant means a large room with floor drains, clean tables, and a blast freezer. Right, that's what we're looking at with a vac sealer and stuff, right? But it still needs to. It's still not cheap. You still need to meet all your regulations and things, and so that's sort of what we're looking to do. Opens a lot more opportunities for us. Maybe even a small canning line in there, to be able to keep doing what we're doing, keep the independence going if they want to, keep our family in it. Not have to ever have a waiting list again for members. Who knows? What I would like to see is that we get big enough. Right now, we're affecting change within families, fishing families and consuming families. But the industry as a whole, we're very, very small. And I don't see us getting to be big. But getting to the size where enough people take notice that, for instance, a fishing company is paying $2 a pound for fish, and the biggest competitor, or the highest competitor, is paying $2.25 a pound. But if we're there and we're big enough and everybody knows we're paying $3, it causes just enough buzz that even the biggest fish companies have to bump their price a little bit. You know, it's like, okay, it's again, because they will at the end of the year do a top-up check if people find out that another company was paying a lot more. They don't want a riot. I mean, the dependent fishermen are kind of stuck, but you know, they have to acknowledge someone's paying more. And if we could just get to that point where it's like enough people know that there's, you know, fishermen getting more for their catch and it is viable, it is sustainable, and it's right that they get their share, that it just forces everything up a little bit and can actually, you know, that would be a nice goal that we're noticed at that point. Maybe not big enough that we're seen as a threat, but acknowledge, you know, have a ripple effect that goes further out.
Do you have any hope, expectations, or concerns about the BC salmon industry in general in the future?
Well, I mean, always concerns because, you know, the hope, well, I have to have hope. I'm a fisherman, right? You're going to catch a lot of fish the next time out. But, I mean, my concerns are, again, like conflicting land uses, conflicting, you know, water use, climate, what's going to happen with, I mean, obviously, you know, increased pipelines and tankers. Well, what can that do? Well, we've seen what it can do, right? There's, right now as we speak, there are a couple of First Nations guys sitting on a boat anchored over top of where the Queen of the North sank, the BC ferry, counting the bubbles of oil that come up, right? That was a ferry. That was, you know, 10 years ago almost. If that was a tanker, my God, that would be the end of fishing out of Douglas Channel, you know. And I know these channels, and I know what can happen. I mean, there was a tanker running around there, not a tanker, a freighter hit ground there this summer. Now, it just happened to be a container ship, and it didn't rupture the hull or something. But if that, oh, it could never happen. Well, it happened this summer. You know, if that was a tanker, man. So there's a lot of things to sort of worry about if we want to, but there's also, you know, optimism. We're growing organically as our community, you know, that people's in concern for food, you know, food sustainability, local food security, and lower carbon foods is growing also. So we have opportunities and challenges.
All right. Do you have any final closing words?
Eat more fish. You know, I'm just really glad to see, you know, that programs like yours are going, that people are really interested in food systems as a way to go, and that the more people pay attention, the more their own decisions can, you know, consumer decisions can be really good. Like I don't know how many people ask me, you know, do you have sell any shrimp? I'm like, do you know how much, like there's like 10 pounds of bycatch for a pound of shrimp coming out of Thailand? Like, you know, and then the people are asking and making better choices because of it, you know, and that there usually are really good options you can do to make change very simply.
What are some of those changes that you recommend?
Well,
for people to easily just...
Well, just with a little bit of research, knowing what is and isn't sustainable, and it's quite easy to find out, right? You know, that you know, whether you choose an albacore tuna over a bluefin, well, you know if you're buying bluefin because you're paying a lot of money, but like over a yellowfin or a skipjack, or, you know, and just in general eating locally. Like even if you want to have shrimp, well, the dried shrimp in BC is way better managed than stuff done in other areas, or you know, the salinated waters in Vietnam where you know, people are polluting themselves by, you know, making these rivers into feedlots. You know, it's like you can do a lot of good by simply consuming the right stuff.
All right. Well, thank you. You've been really helpful.
Yeah, hopefully you can